In our session today, I want to start with some basic housekeeping rules. First of all, we are all looking forward to hearing about the experiences shared by panelists and all of you online. So we would like this to be an engaging interactive session. I would like to encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and start asking the questions that you would like us to pick up during the discussion as we go along. There is some simultaneous translation taking place in French and Spanish. So if you prefer to hear this presentation in Spanish or French, please check on the option at the bottom of your screen. In my screen, there is there under the More option, and there is like a globe that gives interpretation where you can choose your language, and I take the opportunity to thank our interpreter to make this possible today. And finally, we will have a prior access to the recording and resources if we are signed up to the newsletter. So at the end, there will be a link in the chat, or maybe colleagues are already putting the link in the chat, so that make sure you're signed up to the newsletter and you will have advanced access to all the material. So I'm done with our housekeeping, so I would like to kick us off. And this session is the opportunity to launch a new report, an in-practice report called Transforming Economic Inclusion, Government Innovations Through Outcome-Based Financing. And the key topic of this report is around the issue that the households living in poverty and vulnerability often face a double challenge. On one hand, they have increased exposure to economic shock, and at the same time, they lack access to the financial tools that help them manage this risk and build resilience. So figuring out ways to support this household in particular to access financial services is really crucial. And today we are looking in particular through this report to the experience of how outcome-based financing can contribute to deliver this type of services effectively and at scale. We will discuss various topics, and some of the highlights are around how the outcome-based financing mechanisms work to enhance the effectiveness of government programs at scale. We will look in particular at impact bonds, but some of the lessons are more generalizable. We will discuss practical risks and limitations of using this approach in complex settings. And we will hear from the lived experience of delivering some of these approaches, in particular in Colombia, Palestine, and East Africa. As you might have seen from the program, I'm joined by a stellar panel of experts. I will introduce them just before I will pass them the microphone throughout our conversation. So with no further ado, I am gonna pass shortly the microphone to Sebastian Osorio, who comes from Instiglio and will give us the framing presentation for the session. It's gonna be a short 5-minute presentation. Sebastian is associate partner, as I said, at Instiglio. He has more than 15 years of experience doing research, analytics, and he has been leading strategic projects across public and private sector, in particular in Latin America. He regularly provides strategic advice to governments, multilateral organizations, and companies, in particular in around the use of result-based approach. So I'll stop here and I hand over the microphone to you. Sebastian, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Maria. So hi everyone. It's gonna be a short presentation about like kind of the some of the key points of our note. So just to give you a little bit of the little idea that we're sharing in the note that you will be able to access later. So yeah, if I don't know who's in charge of the slides, but like just 5 ideas quickly to kind of have everyone on the same page. The first is like, you know, there's a big challenge. Scaling economic inclusion programs requires navigating complexity, ensuring accountability, and overcoming systemic barriers. And like in general, it's been very hard to kind of tackle this challenge at scale, and outcome-based financing has been trying to kind of address or solve these barriers. So, and the first thing is like most of our economic inclusion programs are really complex and context dependent. They often layer onto existing social safety nets. They bundle between a lot of different type of programs, and the complexity makes it very difficult to define or address what is a result, so what is the real outcome of each of the intervention we're doing. Scaling them requires a lot of innovation and adaptability to changing contexts, and there's a lot of lack of flexibility on working with from the government. The second challenge is ensuring strong accountability at a scale, and a lot of times, like most governments are trying to address inefficiencies or resource misallocation and corruption not well monitored. So that poses a big challenge for these type of programs. And the traditional input activity-based funding that lacks the accountability. We know how we spend the money, but we don't know what we achieve with the money that is being spent. And the outcome-based financing offers a way to enforce that accountability, linking funding to verify results, but applying at a scale is very difficult. And how to embed these type of interventions into the government still is a big challenge for a lot of governments. And obviously working with the governments is complex and hard, and overcoming systemic and institutional barriers is difficult. Governments most of the time are prepared to avoid corruption, and they're not set up in a way that they can be delivering outcomes. They work in rigid system with complex procurement, legal and budget frameworks. There's also a lot of, especially in low and middle income countries, a lot of political instability and short political cycles that threaten the continuity of the outcome-based models, and especially the champions who are working on them. And there's also a lack of good service providers that they have the capacity to operate, or even the tools to enhance their programming. And also doing kind of these type of large scale programs, it has challenges around the high transaction costs and verification costs that makes very difficult to scale up. Go ahead. So there's a potential solution, and that's what we have been working on these note. Outcome-based financing offers a promising mechanism to align incentive and foster innovation and accountability in this economic inclusion. Outcome-based financing is a very simple but powerful idea of time payment to achievement of a specific measurable outcomes, not just input and activities. And how does these OBF answers to this challenge? So the first one is like driving real impact, like trying to link funding to verify outcomes. Second, aligning incentives between multiple stakeholders, from the government who's paying for something, for the people who are working on this, for the service provider who's delivering, and several programs, but they're all thinking about the same outcome. Not each of them thinking about different set of input or activity that they're getting paid off, but actually they're all thinking about the same outcome and how that outcome is going to be achieved. It also encourages innovation and flexibility, and most of the times it allows government to be a little bit more flexible, putting their mindset into achieving the outcome and not just like going through each input or activity and making sure that's being paid for. It obviously increases accountability and transparency, and improves like cost efficiency and effectiveness, especially because you're able to understand how much are you spending per outcome and what are the things that work and what doesn't work. And that can improve service quality and efficiency, like helping create these scalable framework to strengthen economic inclusion programs. Sarah, yeah.
Thank you, Sebastian. In the interest of time, I know you have another couple of slides, but I would like to leave enough space to all to present.
Sure. Let me wrap up like quickly on this, but like something important is like, we present these ideas of outcome-based financing, not as a universal solution, but like we give some ideas on like where is the right context, where does this work well, how to kind of tackle some of the issues that we have find in different governments, or like in the application of these ideas in different settings. And especially like trying to figure out that even though this is not a universal tool that works for everything, there's some ideas on how you can make this work in low and middle income countries. and how the government can be part of this. So go ahead, Sarah. And I think that's Mara kind of like sums up, like there's some strengths, limitation, but especially it's going to give you all like an idea of where the outcome-based financing plays a role on scaling up good innovations for economic inclusion, and where does a good fit for rethinking how to deliver economic policy and actually improve outcomes for the people who live in our countries.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. More in the report, but this was a very good framing for the session, and I'm really pleased to introduce our first panelist from government. So we have with us María del Pilar López-Uribe. Maria is currently the Secretary of Economic Development in Bogotá. She leads efforts to accelerate the city economic recovery, promoting job creation, food supply, boosting entrepreneurship and technological innovation, increase productivity, competitiveness. She has a particular passion for gender equality and have held academic and research position in a very prestigious institution. I'll stop here and I'll pass over the microphone to you, Maria. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mara. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. Because my presentation is really short, I'm going to focus on 3 different things. First, I want to talk about the key contributions that we think OVF gives us. Second, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we face here in Bogotá, being part of the government. And third, give you 3 examples of what we're implementing in the Secretariat of Economic Development. So first, the key or the main contributions that we think is the main value of OVF. Because I'm part of the government, we also think that this is a political decision. I mean, the first thing that we need to think about is that implementing OVF is a political decision because we need to navigate with the regulatory, legal, and financial framework. Institutions in Colombia are very rigid and are not always prepared for the implementation of a different mechanism as OVF. Because of this, public servants, as I am, and my team, don't usually have enough incentive to try different approaches. So in Bogotá, in the case of Bogotá, with the local government that we started beginning of last year, public programs are increasingly turning to OVF as a main tool to amplify their impact and, of course, as a mechanism to increase public spending efficiency. Rather than paying for activities like workshops or trainings, OVF ensures that public spending is tied to concrete, measurable results that improve, of course, people's lives. So our main, what we consider are the main key contributions of OVF. First, focus on measurable results. OVF shifts public spending away from predefined inputs and towards outcomes that really reflect real progress, such in our case, as you mentioned, increased business productivity, job placement, or financial inclusion. Second, incentivizes performance and efficiency by linking payments to results instead, as I was mentioning, activities. OVF motivates policy makers to innovate, optimize resources, and of course, stay focused on what really matters, which is achieving meaningful changes in people's lives. Third, drives innovation and adaptive solutions. OVF gives service providers the flexibility to test, iterate, and scale what we consider could be effective approaches, allowing programs to better respond to real-world challenges rather than follow rigid designs or what has been done for years that we know is not always the best. It doesn't always have the best results. Bogotá, in this case, is not just implementing this model, is actually leading the way. The city has established Latin America's first local OVF board or committee positioning itself as a regional pioneer in driving public innovation, and we're very proud of that. And fourth, and finally, of course, improve accountability through data. We are very lucky because Bogotá has actually good administrative data, and the national government also has good administrative data. Sometimes it's difficult to actually has access to that, but I mean, we have good data. So when we have very clear, defined metrics and rigorous monitoring system, OVF can actually enhance transparency and supports evidence-based decision-making across different public institutions. Number two, what are the challenges that we have faced that we face in Bogotá, and how we actually have addressed these challenges? Because implementing an OVF mechanism or approach in a public institution is not simple a technical decision. It actually requires, as I was saying at the beginning, navigating the structural, cultural, and legal complexities. For the Bogotá Economic Development Secretariat, which is the one that I'm leading, adopting OVF means, of course, questioning how we have always done things, how we actually can build new tools and do things differently. Because of that, we encounter several institutional challenges, and each of them require a strategic solution. First, communicating OVF schemes and mechanisms to stakeholders. One of our main challenges was to actually convey OVF into an understandable, actionable terms for diverse stakeholders. That could be, from the average citizens, internal teams, and city council members, because this mechanism is not familiar. I mean, the mechanism is unfamiliar, and especially the benefits that OVF has, they are not always immediately obvious for people. So we actually kind of like do a pedagogical effort to show how, I mean, that could be, to media, to journalists, to, talking to people, to the city council members, and of course, to also my colleagues and internal teams here in the Secretariat, because we need to actually show how OVF improves outcomes for citizens, making a very strong case, in our case, for the inclusion of this mechanism in the city's development plan at the beginning of last year, which give a lot of flexibilities in the legal frameworks. Number two, adapting the legal and budgetary frameworks. One of the most significant challenges was reaching consensus with local political actors, particularly, as I was mentioning, city council members, on the nature of the interventions that we want. While the contractual forms remain exactly the same, we had to clearly explain what changed was actually, for example, in one case, the payment logic. So it would be tied to specific verifiable results, often measured beyond the fiscal year. And that's also, something that has to change when we plan at the beginning of the year how we're going to spend our budget. We are kind of like enforced to spend all the budget, for example, for 2025 in 2025. But because of here, in this case, we pay at the end, we pay for results, sometimes we actually have to go beyond the fiscal year. And this is not supposed to be allowed. So this is one example of how we actually have to, adapt the budgetary framework to OVF. And that has to be, adapted since the beginning. So as a public institution, this requires not only legal and financial clarity, but also, an institutional backing to innovate responsibly. Through, an intense dialogue and technical, and technical assistance, we secure that the necessary approvals that to move forward while preserving the core principle of OVF, which, as I was mentioning, was paying for results. And third, transforming organizational culture and building internal capacity. So moving from, an activity-based management to results-based thinking mean, of course, a cultural shift. When I was appointed to this role, to this job, and I start talking to my internal teams, most of them didn't know, about OVF, the benefits, but also, about, how to structure a program or a mechanism or a program that use this mechanism. So of course it requires aligned leadership, empowering technical teams, and investing a lot of time and resources into training, which is something that we're doing. And finally, 3 examples of what we are. I mean, this is not the only programs that we're using, the OVF mechanism in Bogotá. These are the programs that we're implementing the OVF mechanism in the Secretariat of Economic Development. So,
Maria, can I ask you to leave these 3 examples here for our audience to see? Because I see there is a question for you from our audience that I want to address. And I hope we can come back to this example in the Q&A that we have at the end.
Perfect.
Or even now. The question comes from Anna, and she was really interested in the OVF board that you set up in Bogotá, and I was also interested. And can you tell us something more about who is part of it and how did you pick members?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we have discussions with all my colleagues, the other secretaries. We first explain, I explain in the government council when we actually meet with the mayor every 2 weeks, that we wanted to strengthen the implementation of OVF programs. Some of them knew about this, some of them didn't know at all. So this is a committee that, the president of the committee is the Secretary of Economic Development, but we have 5 members in the committee. So we have the Secretary of Finance, the Secretary of Development Planning, we have the Secretary of Culture, the Secretary of Social Nets as well. And I think that would be all. And we can invite and the Secretary of Housing. And I think we can invite any secretary that wants to participate and wants to learn. What we do in this committee, for example, we have in a few weeks the next meeting. What we do there is that we discuss any program that wants to implement OVF, the OVF mechanism at the local level, at our local administration. It doesn't matter if it's from, a totally different, topic of coming from a totally different secretariat. We discuss that and we have to approve that it is implementing an OVF mechanism. Why this is important? Because this is the leverage that we use when, for example, what I was mentioning at just now, 5 minutes ago, that if we want to go beyond the fiscal year, we need to have the approval of this committee. So all the benefits that the OVF mechanism has to actually navigate for these rigid, for these legal and financial frameworks, it is, the committee allow us to actually, get this flexibility, which means that not all the programs in the city can actually, for example, go beyond the fiscal year or, have a different kind of legal frameworks. So this is a committee that is kind of like a collective decision, a collective decision place where we can, because decisions are made not only by one person, but by 5 or 6. Then this is the mechanism that we use also to protect public servants in the future when they actually have to face and explain why they go, for example, beyond the fiscal year.
Thank you so much, Maria. This is very interesting. I work with government, and one of the big challenges is in working with government is the turnover of people. And you might work with somebody and then they move on. It seems that this committee allows quite a bit of institutional memory of how things are done. Thanks for sharing. And I am keen to introduce our next panelist, who is Celeste Brubaker. Celeste is an independent consultant. She is working and has worked in increasing the uptake of outcome-based contracting and innovative financing, especially in economic inclusion throughout her career. In the past, over 10 years, she was leading at Village Enterprise. Recently, she was the Chief of Impact and Innovative Financing there. And in that role, she was the person who has been leading the organization Social Outcome Contracting initiative at large. And she was really following and curating the monitoring and measurement to bring evidence-led improvements in the sector. I'll stop here, Celeste. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mara, and good day, everybody. Today, I'm excited to share Village Enterprise's experience co-designing and implementing the first Development Impact Bond, or DIB, for poverty alleviation in Africa. This project was built on a simple but powerful idea, tie funding to real-world results. Next slide, please. When the project launched, 1 in 10 people globally were living in extreme poverty, half of them in sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, traditional aid often struggled to deliver consistent, measurable results. And that's where outcomes-based financing, or OBF, comes in. We launched this project as we believed that enabling funders to pay only for what works would provide significantly greater value for money compared to the status quo. The Village Enterprise DIB piloted this new model, tying funding to one clear outcome: increased household income among the extreme poor. Next slide, please. This was a complex but ultimately powerful partnership. A total of $5.3 million was committed by the outcomes funders, of which $4.28 million was reserved as outcomes funding. To implement, Village Enterprise raised $2.3 million in upfront investment. If and only if results were achieved, the outcome funders reimbursed Village Enterprise, who then reimbursed investors. The results were pretty transformational. Over 95,000 lives were impacted, more than 4,700 businesses launched, and over 480 savings groups formed. 3/4 of participants were women. An independent impact evaluation confirmed that household incomes increased enough to generate over $21 million in lifetime income, 4 times the overall cost of the project. Next slide, please. Here is a graphical illustration of the impact bond structure. At the core of this structure is the alignment of financial incentives around measurable outcomes. In this case, increasing household incomes. Philanthropic funders, USAID, FCDO, and a private funder provided the outcomes funding, meaning they only paid if the pre-agreed results were achieved. A trustee, GDI, was commissioned to hold and disperse funds following accepted validation of outcomes achievement. Upfront working capital was provided by impact investors who assumed the initial performance risk. If the program delivered results, they were repaid with returns from the outcomes funding. Village Enterprise implemented the Poverty Graduation Program, which combined cash transfers, business training, mentorship, and support to start savings groups. Village Enterprise was responsible for raising the working capital and contracted with the impact investors directly. ID Insight, an independent outcomes evaluator, used a randomized control trial to rigorously verify results. And finally, Instiglio, an OBF intermediary, acted as the project manager. Next slide, please. The model wasn't just a funding shift, it drove learning and operational excellence. Major improvements included creation of a stronger adaptive management system that strengthened how Village Enterprise measures and manages impact, accelerated adoption of technology, including tablets and customized dashboards for its frontline workers, updated training and mentoring curriculums, and rapid rollout of digital seed capital to ensure programming continuity during the COVID-19 pandemic. VE then extended those internal improvements across the entire organization. The project also increased Village Enterprises' visibility in the space, positioning them to further grow their service reach. Next slide, please. Of course, there were real challenges. COVID-19 disrupted the impact evaluation timeline, delaying outcomes payments and raising broader questions about who should bear risk beyond performance risk. The delay triggered intensive stakeholder negotiations where Village Enterprise was responsible for representing investor interests. As a service provider, that was a heavy lift. And so in hindsight, having the project manager also represent investors could have strengthened governance. More frequent outcome evaluation touchpoints could have reduced the disruption caused by the evaluation delays and also enabled more adaptive learning during program implementation. The program spanned 2 countries, but outcome payments were based on average results across the entire portfolio. Future designs may benefit from defining success at the country level to better reflect contextual differences. OBF it's not just a technical mechanism, it's a mindset shift. It can drive accountability, learning, and a focus on real impact. And so while the DIB achieved this, simpler models, such as performance-based contracts, may also deliver these benefits. And so building on this experience, Village Enterprise launched a second simplified OBF project with the government of Rwanda and USA DIV. And in this simplified OBF project, we also saw the power of outcomes-based thinking in action. I want to close out with this simple message for other service providers listening in. This model of funding may sound intimidating, but it's more doable than you might think. With the right partners and a well-defined structure, outcomes-based financing can be a powerful tool to advance your mission. It pushed Village Enterprise to improve how it operates, adapt new technologies, and stay laser-focused on the people it serves. And while DIBs can be complex, simpler models like performance-based contracts can also offer many of the same benefits. What matters most is embracing the mindset, accountability, continuous improvement, and a relentless focus on impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Celeste. You really show that Village Enterprise was a learning organization. I take advantage of my chair position because I'm really curious on what is it that you had to let go in the simplified model. And in letting go part of a design, I wonder if you brought in some potential risks that needs to be managed and considered, or it was the best of both worlds.
Yeah, so in the simplified model, we had a bilateral contract between Village Enterprise and USAID. And so a lot of the intermediaries, like a project manager, a trustee, those were not part of the program. The main thing that we let go of was, in addition to that, was the investors. And so, in the impact bond, really what the outcome funders were doing is they were shifting all of the performance risk off of themselves. In the case of this updated contract, USAID and Village Enterprise were sharing the performance risk. So the project was set up as a milestone-based contract. And so some of the milestones were more proximate milestones and some were impact milestones. And so some of the payments for the proximate milestones provided Village Enterprise working capital to implement. Now, that said, the proximate payments didn't cover all of our implementation costs. So in this project, Village Enterprise was assuming some of the financial performance risk tied to performance, rather than being able to offboard all of it to investors.
Thank you so much, Celeste. I think I have a time for a question from you in terms of in many of the countries where you operate, there is conflict, risk, and crisis. So this will affect communities, affect people. And can you reflect on the adjustment that maybe you had to make into the measurement when those disruption take place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something that was part of those intense discussions, thinking about should we adjust the metrics for the impact bond when everything was disrupted by COVID-19. And there was actually pretty strong feelings that the metrics themselves should not be adjusted. That in this context, it's more important than ever to hold the service providers accountable for serving the beneficiaries in the countries. And so the general idea that Village Enterprise would be paid $1 for every dollar that we increased household incomes, that stuck. However, what we did note is that there was a new risk that entered the equation, and this is something that we hadn't considered when we were designing the project. And this was the risk that there would be non-evaluation, but it wasn't anybody's fault. It wasn't because of evaluator non-compliance and it was a context where we did not want to trigger force majeure. And so that's where there is a discussion around, well, is that really a risk that the investors should take on? At the time, it wasn't actually even clear how long the evaluation delay would be. It ended up being for 1 year. And so what we ended up revising was actually the payment floor, the total amount that the investors could lose. And so when we initially did contracting, the payment floor was 0, and we raised that to 40% for a portion of the outcomes payment, which was a good compromise, considering that this sort of new risk around non-evaluation is really not something that the investors had meant to take on to begin with.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you for sharing candidly the difficulties. There are questions in the chat that maybe we'll pick up at the end, in particular around what was the return for the investor, if that can be shared, or more details on what metrics you use in the M&E. But I'm keen to bring in our next panelist, who is Marinella Ariano. Marinella is a senior expert in private sector development at the World Bank. Her work has been focusing on local development, tourism, youth entrepreneurship, M&E, matching grants. She's been working extensively in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Africa, and has several publications. We are keen to learn from you. Marinella, over to you.
Yes, first of all, Mara, thank you so much for this beautiful introduction. Really grateful for it. So, as Mara said, my name is Marinella Ariano. I'm going to present on behalf of the team of the Finance for Jobs projects, the Palestinian Development Impact Bond for skills development and employment. Before we start, I want to thank the TTL Abed Khatib and the team members for allowing me to be here with you today, and of course the organizers. So, looking at the DIB was created and implemented to address the challenge of high unemployment in the West Bank and Gaza. The DIB was originated primarily for the West Bank, but then, as we will see, it was a pilot was also launched in Gaza that unfortunately had to stop given the current circumstances. So what at the time of preparation of the DIB, the bank team and the stakeholders realized that in the labor market there is a big mismatch between skills, between demand and supply of skills. So the DIB aimed to address part of this mismatch, focusing on unemployed youth and hard-to-reach population, also on women, since it was agreed that at least 30% of the cohort of beneficiaries had to be women, given their low labor participation in the labor market. So the amount of the DIP turned out to be 6.5 million, and why the team chose an outcome-based approach. A bit, there was the desire of doing something new, something that could focus on results, and also primarily on the relationship between money and results. And the idea of generating a traditional program that would have just financed, again, inputs was not what really the team wanted to do. Took a risk and launched an experience that in a certain way was a pilot and allowed to generate the lessons not only for the Palestinian context, but also for other FCVs and other countries. Also, the team was looking for more accountability, transparency, and even to understand more in reality what really works and what does not in terms of creation of employment and skills development. Next slide, please. Okay, so now if we focus on the left, the table here presents the results, the final results that were achieved by the DIP. And as you can see, the DIP overachieved its target. And also regarding the female participation target, the percentage of 30% was way beyond surpassed. On the left, you can see the triggers that generated the payments by the outcome funders. So this overachievement of results was possible through the work of 9 service providers for 13 programs. The bank was one of the outcome funders, and the DIP, since it aimed to generate employment, was sector agnostic. So basically, the service providers had the freedom to apply and with youth programs in the sectors that they considered could offer the jobs that we were aiming at. So on the right side, you can see the structure of the DIP, where there are 4 investors, social investors, 2 local, 2 international, that created a special purpose vehicle, the SPV, that managed really the DIP. Subcontracted service providers, pay them based on the results they achieved. And then the SPV reported these results to an independent verification agent that, through a very specific methodology, verified them and then allowed the payment by the outcome funders. So the bank is one of the ministry of the Palestinian authorities. Before it was finance and then turned out to be planning. Now, all these relationships are codified in the outcomes contract that was a very good instrument to have good management and support strong performance. Next slide, please. So, what changed during implementation? In reality, not much. The model was never revised, and also the metrics were not revised because the DIP responded well to the circumstances and the challenges provided by the context. Just to give you an idea, the DIP was launched at the end of November 2019 and closed at the beginning of 2024. So it went through COVID, a first war in Gaza, but still, because of its inner flexibility, was able to address the challenges that the context, the challenges that arise from the context. In particular, to make an example, during COVID, 2 programs were financed to have more nurses and doctors. So in a way, the response was there. As I told you, the final amount was 6.5 million. So in reality, the bank put more money because the initial amount of the DIP was 5 million. So the bank, seeing the good results and in agreement with the stakeholders, operated an additional financing. And an example of this is that when the outcome funders finished their payments, the social investors and the SPV decided to continue to invest and continue to finance programs as long as they could, so to continue to produce good results. So at the end, the outcome funders paid less for more results. As I told you, a pilot was launched in Gaza that was stopped, and also the DIP used a staggered approach that was further staggered during its lifetime. Next slide, please. So there are many things and many lessons. I try to be as concise as possible, but the main lesson that I want to share with you are the following. As also the other panelists said, preparing and launching this kind of novel instruments requires an hands-on process, a high level of commitment and coordination from all the stakeholders. And the World Bank, the PEI, led this process, the Project Implementation Agency. The design of the DIP was simple. So in general, for development projects, it's always good to have a simple design. And in this case, this simplicity paid off even more. Also was very flexible. I mentioned that the DIP was sector agnostic and also allowed to respond to circumstances and also rooted in local context. And this is something that should not be dismissed because to respect local culture, local constraints is always key to have successful projects that bring good results. Now, the DIP was for creation of employment. In fact, was the first in the MENA region that aimed to employment and one of the first of the World Bank. So one lesson was to have a social investor that understands the language of the private sector and is able to speak with it is very important. In terms of gender angle, at the beginning, the tariffs had a premium of 15% for female beneficiaries, but this was not key to the success. Really, it was a matter of the jobs present in the labor market and also of the work of the service providers. The independent verification should always consider the local context. And one thing that I really consider key of this success is the team that worked in the field. Eventually, everything boils down to human beings. And in the case of the DIP, there was a very highly motivated team in the SPB that worked hard to produce the results. So much so that at the moment we launched the second DIP. So we are implementing DIP 2. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marinella. I'll come straight with a question that in part I already asked Celeste, the question from Sarah Ward in the chat. In your case in particular, there is a tension with conflict and crisis and displaced population in Gaza. You didn't mention much of that. Can you reflect a little bit on how that influenced the design and the delivery of this particular project?
Yes, I did not mention much of it because as I said, the first experience was launched mainly for the West Bank and then expanded to Gaza. It was a pilot. So the context, the team wanted to explore the context and understand what was feasible. Now with the second DIP, Gaza was one of the targets. Unfortunately, the circumstances did not allow us to do anything there. So right now the DIP is in a we call it in a discovery phase. So precisely because the environment is very complex, even more complex, and also the West Bank is affected by the consequences that are showing from the war in Gaza, conflict in Gaza. So we are exploring what is feasible. The team is exploring what is feasible and is focusing on opportunities that exist in the West Bank. Of course, we hope and pray that soon we can resume our work in Gaza. But at the moment, this is not yet at the horizon. So for now, we are working mainly in the West Bank. That is also very challenging.
In what way the challenges are influencing the choice of your outcomes and measurement? I think this is what Sarah was trying to get at.
Yes. So I think that this is a very important point. The challenge, we are not going to change the outcomes or the metrics for the triggers for the payments or the metrics. This is not what the challenges are affecting. There's been a discussion about the tariffs, so how much to pay for these outcomes and how much to pay for these results. And so in defining the tariffs, we have to incorporate the risk provided by the context. Another thing is really how much, in which sector is possible to operate and with which service providers, because some of them are struggling. So to give you an example, before a service providers could work throughout the West Bank, now it has to have more geographical focus. So we are looking also at service providers that can cover specific areas. So it's not in terms, again, of outcomes, we are not going to change them. The triggers are those ones and they worked well, but it's more a matter of seeing how much to pay for them and also where and who can implement the programs for youth and women at the moment. There are mobility restrictions, to be clear. Some areas are off limits. We cannot go there.
Thank you. Thank you. It seems really challenging to in the implementation phase and gathering data. I'll come back to you in the discussion that will kick off shortly. There are more questions for you in the chat, and they will be picked up. But to open our discussion, we have the privilege of having with us Paul Hamlin. He will be kicking off a conversation with some reflections. Paul has been working since 2019 until very recently as the USAID Development Innovation Venture Program lead. He's been conducting the diligence on the application, managing grants on different topics like healthcare, early childhood development, sanitation, in various areas. He focused in particular on the result-based grants like that are known as fixed amount awards, and he also managed the USAID portion of support to village enterprise development impact bond that we just heard from Celeste earlier. Before this role, he was still at USAID focusing on economic growth. So I'll stop here, Paul. I'll hand it over to you to kick us off with an engaging discussion.
Great. Thank you so much to the organizers. Good day to everybody listening in. It's very interesting and I think very important topic for us to talk about. I think we all recognize there's a tremendous need to move away from focusing on inputs and activities and moving down that spectrum towards outputs and even outcomes and ultimately impacts. But moving along that spectrum is potentially difficult. And we heard some of the people talk about the benefits of aligning everyone to focus on results and outcomes and impacts. But we also heard, I think, some of the participants here and the speakers today talking about the challenges that come along with it. Now, whether we're talking about development impact bonds or result-based financing or outcome-based financing, I put them all sort of in the same toolbox. And a development impact bond indeed is one of the more high-profile, more complicated, more sophisticated, and in some ways more glamorous tools in the box that we have. But nonetheless, they're all just tools that are at our disposal to use. I think there's a couple challenges with outcomes-based financing that I've heard from the colleagues today, as well as from my own experience. And one of them is, where do we set our indicators on that spectrum from activities to outcomes and to impacts? Ideally, we want to set the indicators at the easiest place to collect the data. But that requires that we know that the easiest place is indicative of the results and the impacts. So if we were talking about vaccine delivery, and I know today's topic is a little different, vaccine delivery, generally, if we know vaccines are delivered in people's arms, we know that the impact is going to be positive. There's plenty of evidence out there, and we can rely on that administrative data. But something like an economic growth program, we have to collect the data at a later stage because we're not certain that things are going to result in the impacts we want. And that's especially true if we consider that one of the advantages mentioned today is that by focusing on the outcomes, we give the implementing partners a lot of flexibility to be creative, to respond to changes in the operating environment, or to implement new and innovative strategies and techniques. If we are doing that, then unfortunately, we can't rely as much on easily collected and existing administrative data. We have to ensure that we are collecting that end result data using generally a third party, which adds in more complexity. It adds in more cost, and it also adds in even a greater time lag between the implementation of the program and the collection of the data and the verification of the data, and then ultimately that payment. And in the case of the development impact bond, a 1-year delay for most investors is simply not acceptable. If they are expecting their investment to be repaid, and then all of a sudden we say, well, we can't pay you today, we can pay you maybe a year from now when we finish the randomized control trial, most investors are not going to be very pleased with that. And so these are some of the challenges that come along with the opportunities of outcome-based financing. From my perspective, and I think several of you touched on it, one of the main advantages and disadvantages or challenges of outcomes-based financing is this question of risk. If we are moving from paying for activities to paying for results, we're essentially shifting the risk burden from the people who are funding it, whether those are governments or donors or philanthropies or the World Bank. We're shifting that risk from the people paying for the implementation to the people who are implementing the program. And if we involve outside investors, we can also shift some of the risk to them. But in doing this risk transfer, we have to make sure that everyone who's involved is prepared for that. And I think in some cases, not everyone is as responsive and thoughtful as Village Enterprise and some of the other implementing partners. Many of the implementing partners out there who are very good at their work have built their business model, if you will, around cost reimbursement mechanisms, and they are simply not structured or prepared or staffed, and they don't have the systems necessary to implement an outcomes-based financing mechanism, because that's not how they built their business. And I say business, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit implementing partner, they all have legal charters, they all have legal status, they all have employees and assets, and they operate at their core very much like each other, regardless of whether their ultimate goal is profit or not. And so I think that one of the big challenges is getting everyone not just to align around a particular instrument or a particular intervention in one or more countries for a specific time period, but getting everyone to start aligning in the longer term in all contexts, in all programmatic areas around this idea that we should be pushing the focus down towards the outcomes and the impacts and the results. But we also need to be at the same time ready and able to push the risk away from those funding the program to those implementing the program. And I think if we can do that, a key result, which one of the panelists mentioned, is that the mindset of the organization is also changed by implementing these programs, because no longer are we just counting the widgets that we produce or the training sessions that we hold. We're actually doing those in order to achieve that final result. And I would also throw in one more challenge that I think people maybe touched on, but maybe didn't call out today, is that I have somewhat of a concern that outcomes-based financing mechanisms the term itself will be taken advantage of because there are very different incentives for governments and implementing partners and other stakeholders involved that they will want to be seen as results-based and results-focused, but they will have the incentive to move towards the safer end of that results spectrum or value chain, if you will, towards the activities and towards the outcomes and away from the results and impacts, which are more difficult to achieve, more difficult to measure, take longer to measure. And in doing so, we might see that this kind of better way of doing things is actually being diluted a little bit because people are tending towards the safer end of the spectrum, especially when they are asked to take on risks which historically they have not been asked to take on. So those are some thoughts for everyone. How am I doing on time, Maria?
You're doing great, Paul, and you raised a very, very big question. I'll floor one of those to the speakers. Raise your hand who wants, because I think they are addressed to all of you, these challenges, and maybe we will pick them up in the general discussion in a second. But you open talking about the shift from activities to output to outcomes, and you close again, like there is a risk that we abuse the term because it's very sexy, but in fact, we are still measuring activities and we hang on to the appeal of being results based or led. So I wonder if any of our panelists wants to venture, like, where do we set these indicators? There's always a balance. All the result-based and outcome-based approaches I've seen use a mix of output and outcomes. Sometimes one might call activities like the engagement of participants, and there is a philosophical discussion if engaging difficult to engage groups are an output or an activity. I'll park that. How do you set your North Star, the balance between output and outcomes in your payment mechanism? And how do you protect the instruments from being just a nice label, but then not being really, really a mindset shift that looks at outcome? I'm going to call Celeste.
I'll jump in with a little bit of how Village Enterprise has been thinking about this. And so, as we previously discussed with the impact bond, we were looking at attributable impact on income. And this was measured using a randomized control trial. Now, that's like the final instance in our theory of change. And so along the way in our theory of change, there's these different like activities and then results that are supposed to happen to lead to that increase in income. And so one of the things that Village Enterprise was thinking about is, okay, we need to have an RCT, we need to validate that indeed we're increasing income, but then can we use that randomized control trial and our internal data to do further validation on the internal theory of change, so that maybe for future projects, we can be reasonably confident that, like, let's say that savings is increasing with savings groups or among households, if business groups are launching their businesses and they have like high enough revenue and so forth, we can be reasonably confident that these intermediate outcomes are leading to the final outcome. And so some of what we did with the RCT analysis with ID Insight is tie the internal monitoring and evaluation data to the final outcome data and run correlation analysis to help validate, can we be confident enough in our theory of change? And so in doing that, we actually saw Village Enterprise has this rating system for businesses that based on 5 different indicators, the business can be green, or it can be orange, or it can be in the red. And I think you can imagine what those colors mean. And then we saw these really strong correlations that indeed, if a business is in the green, that this is a household where we've seen, or this is a type of household where there's like higher impact also. And so do that type of analysis helps give us confidence then to feel like, okay, for future projects, looking at like some of these intermediary outcomes like business indicators that are easier to attribute to the project and don't necessarily need an RCT, or randomized controlled trial for measurement, that can be good enough. So that's how Village Enterprise has been thinking about it.
Thank you, Celeste. It requires certain confidence that the world will remain stable, I think. But I've seen many projects using the RCT to strengthen the theory of change, and when there is sufficient confidence in a metric, they try to be parsimonious and find metrics that seem to be a good indicator, like Paul was saying with the vaccine, for instance, and pushing a little bit the boundaries. Lots of questions on the...
Mara, sorry, can I add one
Of
thing?
course,
Yes.
come in, Marinella.
So we are in a conflict zone. So where our DIP is implementing a conflict zone. So it's not possible to think that we can do all the impact evaluation by the books as we wish we could do. but there are objective constraints and challenges. So I think that Paul has raised very important points, but I think also that there are several types of measurements. And in the case of our DEEP, we were able to measure results up to 6 months after the treatment took place. So in a way, there is a lifespan that can be included in the programs, because we are not thinking of always very short programs, but programs that give a certain amount of time to measure some results and attribute them with certainty to the program. Now, also, since, as Paul said, a shift is needed in culture, in the case of the Palestinian DEEP, the first 3 triggers were more output-oriented, but in the outcome contract, it was established that no more than 40% of the payments will go towards those outputs, but majority of payments had to go toward the outcomes. And also, in terms of service providers, it is true that for them it was like a shift in their culture, you know, to work on results with results-based instrument, but it happened. And some service providers were even grateful, because they said, thanks to DEEP, we were able now to develop a kind of new culture that helped us also with other programs. So what I want to say is that really focusing on M&E, focusing on measuring results, focusing on verifying results for how it's possible given the circumstances, I think always rewarding. And I want to close say one thing. I'm a big passionate of the art of Giotto. I don't know if you know him, but Giotto was a tsunami in Western world, for the art of the Western world, because he just did what he liked to do. And he brought new ideas, he opened for the Renaissance. So I think it's good to push and to try to do what we believe could be useful. And also programs are defined in their nitty-gritty. So to define well who the target group and how to put the right incentives, it's worth it. I think it allows to be innovative. Thank you.
Thank you, Marinella. I'll pick up some of the questions, and also to the other panelists, please jump in. It's a very friendly and informal conversation. But one of the questions, moving us away a little bit from the metric, from Betsy, is about genuine inclusivity. The question is, I appreciate and agree with the ideas and the significant outcomes in empowering vulnerable people to lift them out of extreme poverty. However, do you have more plan in the future to be more inclusive to different people that need the support? So this is the depth, like how deep you go in being inclusive, maybe addressing people that are displaced, that have very lower salaried civil servants, people in conflict and disaster. So very specific intervention for these particular groups.
I can jump in. Let me see, because my Wi-Fi is not working, but I think now it works. So I mean, I couldn't actually mention what we're doing in Bogotá, but we're actually working with entrepreneurs and small businesses to increase their productivity, and also to help them, well, with financial inclusion. But one of them is our program on job placement, and this is going to be our second wave. We have, this is 2 years ago. We actually had an OVF mechanism implemented with job placement. But it's very important to actually see that we use different services providers. We generate different incentives depending on the characteristics of the people who actually get the job. So we have different incentive. If it's a person that is, is a woman, we have incentive also, for migrants, and we have different incentive for youth and people, that are 50 years and older with a low level of education. So we try to use different kind of services providers, and the idea is that one service providers focus on one specific group, And then, we actually, we make a payment and a different payment. If this group, if it's a percentage of this, full group, it is migrants or women or youth or people, that are 50 years, adults, 50 years and older. So we kind of like try to use, for the same program, to kind of generate different incentive that makes different services providers to compete, and then decide, because some of these providers are good getting, getting woman jobs, or some of them, they're familiar with youth population. So we kind of like try to see how the service providers prefer to focus on some populations that we're interested in, and to actually focus on that, and then they have different incentive for that.
Thank you, Maria. Sebastian, you've been very quiet. Can I call you in? Like,
Yep,
you
great.
have experience in so many countries.
Yeah, I was thinking about like kind of both questions, that like the previous one about the outcomes and actually how to target better, and something that we have been discussing and create some tension sometimes, especially with teams with the multilateral banks, and especially with the more technical teams, about that discussion about like what is the right like kind of impact measurement or outcome that you're expecting from one of these programs. And sometimes when you work with government don't have the luxury of like piloting something that you can actually have like the right like evidence to say I'm gonna do these, and there's some tension sometimes about like I'm gonna do something better than what is the status quo of a government procurement system, or I'm gonna do something that is what we dream about, like how to test it. And we usually are navigating, especially from our role, like providing technical assistance to governments and to like outcome payers. Like we're trying to navigate that tension a lot of times, and that's also kind of a part of the discussion about like how you focus your programs on certain populations, right? And there's like a lot of research that need to be done about how you learn better to address these, for example, gender issues. So there's a discussion that we were having working with Bogotá about like, oh, how can we target like more women to get jobs? But actually all the programs for job placement for women, for broad population, they're mostly used by women, right? So it's like not, they don't have a particular access barrier, but the question is like, what is happening behind to let us design something that is actually going to improve outcome for women. And then we were thinking, oh, okay, maybe we can have a payment premium if you place more women after a certain point. But the question is how much more, right? Like, does it actually is that so simple to tackle? So we're always trying to navigate like how to create the right incentive framework to make sure we are learning enough for the government to actually deliver better programs. And as the secretary was explaining, in this case, like for example, for women, or for example, youth mothers, or for people about 50 years old, like we figure out the model itself is not that different. It's more about like choosing the right service provider. So probably you're not going to pay different to each of them, but you want to understand that some people know better how to work with certain populations and some other with other. And then you figure out like it's not about the payment metric itself, because for all of them it's going to be job placement, but actually you say, okay, women are in the core of my public policy. I'm going to allocate more money and more of my goal to this population that I know is more important for me than certain others, to kind of send the signal to the market. So that's kind of what we're doing. But obviously there's a lot of different ways. And I think the tricky part of working with governments on this is like each of them, they have a different goals and procurement rules and way of defining what is important, because some say, yeah, like let's put the gender lens on this, but like for each of them, it might mean something different. So we don't have like one just like one method that is going to work for each of them.
Thank you, Sebastian. Talking of who you engage. I'm picking up another question from our audience, and the question is from Teresa, who is interested in your experience in including private sector actors that are not the typical actors in the development sector. Is there any experience past or prospective in including these actors from any of the panelists? Including Paul.
I don't know if it can be of relevance, but in the Palestinian DIP, we've worked with the private sector. So for the investors the investors were coming from the private sector. And of course, there were questions I mean, to align all these different words took some time, to unify the languages, the interests, and the incentives, but it worked. And also it showed a kind of social responsibility that at the end, ultimately, even this private sector was interested not only in its own benefits, but in generating social benefits like employment for youth, for women that were socially excluded. So it is possible. And for what we have seen is that these outcome-based instruments are really like boxes where you can put a bit of everything. You have to just adapt to the circumstances, challenges, because our DIP was for employment, different from the DIP presented by Celeste. So there is room for different teams, topics, and working with the different actors.
Thank you, Marinella. So Celeste, you were next in line. While you were answering all the questions in the chat, I'm impressed by your multitasking. Celeste.
So Village Enterprise has, I don't know if this will take off, but Village Enterprise has partnered with Common Good Marketplace, who they are an actor that is aiming to establish a social outcomes marketplace for tradable asset. And so we've partnered with them, and the idea is to see, can we bring to market verified impact assets, or VIAs, and then sell them ideally to corporations. And so it's kind of testing, like, through this marketplace, can we crowd in new funding that's not your traditional aid funder, but instead is more like your corporation that has like impact aligned CSR strategies and might be interested in being able to account for that positive impact that they're paying for is part of their social impact accounting. And so it's something that we've brought our first issuance to market. We're preparing our second issuance, and it's an exploration period right now to see if there will be traction and if this could be a feasible way to bring in more private sector engagement on the outcomes funding side.
Thank you, Celeste. Teresa, I hope we answer your question a little bit, but I see Paul, you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, in terms of working with the private sector or even engaging with governments or any other stakeholders, which maybe are not traditionally part of the kind of development landscape that some of us know, I think the word I would use is simpatico. They have to be well aligned in terms of what they're trying to achieve and why they're interested. And I use this word simpatico because also I think there's also often just a simple language gap between, especially when you're talking about private sector or you're talking about investors, they use very different terminology, right? So when you talk about returns to investors, they're strictly talking financial returns like you learn in business school. And so when you start talking about return on investment, that includes intangibles or non-financial returns and things like that, just as one example, you're quickly maybe going to lose them because they're not going to understand what you're talking about. And so the language barrier is a real one, and one that you have to appreciate and make sure that you're speaking the same language when you're talking with these stakeholders.
Thank you, Paul. I see a note from Sarah in the chat, given that we have a lot of learning on market-based approaches and market system, and her wish that those learning are transferred over in this environment and they don't sit in silos. So thank you for your comment, Paul. I would like to bring out one of the points that you raised before on and that you are making even now on the culture and the fact that you need to be simpatico. And you raised an issue before on the investor who might not find acceptable 1 year delay. And so this is something I find often in my engagement in this sector and with government, the question whether investor is necessary at all, if we should work with venture philanthropists instead. And so what is the experience of panelists of what makes you go to investors in the first place, and what are you looking for in an investor? And I'll come to Sebastian first. You've been quite quiet, and then maybe Maria.
So, you know, I maybe I go back kind of to the idea of this private sector role, and I think the private sector has different role that they can play to support like outcome-based funding with the government. You know, just being an investor is just one of those ways they can support, but they can also support in really paying for outcomes as well. It's not only being an investor. I think like obviously there's a very important push from, you know, the impact investment, like kind of movement on making sure there's kind of a financial sense and a lot of interventions. But like also talking about like economic inclusion, like there's a lot of these projects that one, like they're not like they don't give financial returns on the operation of the project itself. You know, like delivering outcome for micro populations in a lot of these contexts doesn't deliver like a financial return, right? Like the financial return is made from a premium that is from whoever is paying, that recognize the risk that an investor is taking. So I think that's something important to understand, because sometimes, you know, there's some sectors where like probably the financial return is more evident, especially where there's money involved, like things, for example, related to health, right? Like there's a lot of like models where you can think about like OBF and a return on investment. But a lot of the things or the problems where we're working, no one is kind of making a financial return on those projects, right? The second part is about like, okay, if you wanna really have an investor, like that's just one model, and obviously there's a lot of like different ways that the private sector can work with the government. But the first one is the government needs to or should be willing to work with the private investor and recognize that premium payment, right? And that's something that we have found very important. For example, when we launch all these OBF ecosystem in Colombia, because like the government wasn't willing to take the risk. So the investor play a huge role on like catalyzing those innovations and allowing the government to scale up. But then later, it was the government itself just paying better the service providers. So I think like to that discussion of investor is important, but I will say it's a little bit secondary on the discussion of like, is my model, like who's this model for, right? Like are we really thinking that the private sector is going to pay for things that don't have financial returns or not? Because that's kind of where it becomes tricky. But I don't know, Mari, if I really answer your question, or I was trying to go like kind of sideways, just to say like this is not something that is going to work always to bring financial returns.
Thank you, Sebastian. I'll come to you, Maria, for a comment, but I note in the chat, Sarah raised a good point, and the expectation that given the financial crunch we are at the moment, maybe going to the private sector is something we'll see more often. And I encourage our panelists to put comments in the chat because I guess we will be running out of time soon. And Maria, I promise to give you the microphone. You might be the last comments from our panelists.
Okay, there are two Marias, so okay.
Maria del Pilar, the other is Marinella.
Well, I mean, with respect to public sector as investor, well, right now the investors, the real investors, in our case, is the government. right now. We actually tried to work on a fund last year, but it was with the private sector as an investor. And we kind of like, we're still discussing that, but it's really difficult sometimes to align the timing of the bonds with, you know, what I was mentioning before, you know, the timing that we actually have at, you know, when you are government. When you have, you know, you need to verify different requirements. You need to, you know, use the resources at different times. And, you know, the public sector usually, I mean, they don't usually are fully aligned. Now we use the private sector as our service providers, of course. So in the case of job placements, well, the job agencies are the main ones, with the other ones with the businesses and entrepreneurs for increased productivity and financial inclusion. We're thinking of, you know, working in the case of productivity. We are thinking to work with universities, service providers, that actually, you know, because we focus on some type of training for the businesses that are related to, you know, circular economy, artificial intelligence, and the other ones is data analytics. So, you know, the universities, they already have kind of like a good, a robust structure that give us some kind of like, you know, kind of like support that we might work with that, but it's not, I mean, we need to wait at the end, because they might need to also work with another type of businesses. Then in terms of financial inclusion, we might think of working with microfinances and fintechs. So that would be our services providers. So the service providers. So, you know, depending on what we're talking about, the service providers are actually the private sectors for us. And very important, in the case of the entrepreneurs and the businesses, actually the beneficiaries are also private sector.
Thank you so much, Maria. It really pains me to stop our discussion here. Is really rich, and I didn't manage to go to all the questions that are in the chat. I hope our panelists can cast an eye. We only have a couple of minutes and 2 questions that we would like to ask you for feedback. Your feedback really helps us to improve this type of session, to make them more helpful to you going forward. And I ask my colleagues to launch a Zoom poll. There are just 2 questions that I'm gonna read aloud for you, and they should appear on screen any second now. So question 1, would you use ideas and materials from this session for your future work in this area? And you should pick one. Is either you strongly agree, don't know, disagree, or strongly disagree. And the second question is, would you recommend this webinar series to your colleagues? Again, you strongly agree, don't know, disagree, or strongly disagree. As you complete the poll, I take the last few seconds to thank our panelists for a really enriching discussion. And for all of you, it has been wonderful to file your questions to the panelists. You made my job very, very easy. Thank you for the interpreters. I have a lot of points that I'm taking away from government and having a central committee to how you work in very difficult environment, the trade-offs between having something that is really accountable and robust, but also feasible and pragmatic, and how we can use evaluation. Being an academic, I tend to blow up the evaluation, but we need to be mindful that sometimes we know enough and we can just implement. So I'll stop here. I just want to thank you, all of you, and I look forward to see you on the next webinar on this session. Stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Mara, also.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mara.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.